Couple things before the video starts. A, there's a dragon fight happening. B, I talk very loudly sometimes. And C, I make some exaggerated examples. Now, enjoy this garbage. Hey there. If you're watching this video, then either you've made the biggest mistake so far in 2020 or you're in my ethics and morality class. If you're associated with either of these, you should leave, or go on your phone, or talk to your friend. Do anything other than watch this video, because let's face it, it's probably garbage, like hot trash. Anyways, we're in my room. I know you can't tell because you're watching a game being played because my capture card stopped working because I wanted to remake this video, and everything's falling apart now, and it's great. Moving on. I'm here to talk about capital punishment. What is capital punishment? Capital punishment, also known as the death penalty, is the execution of an offender sentenced to the death after they've been convicted by a court of law. So essentially, you commit a crime evil and nefarious enough, you die by the hand of the law. Whether it be hanging, guillotining, electrocution, there's a bunch up there. You can take your pick. So, you know the absolute bare bones of it. When did it come to life? Ancient Greece enforced the death penalty under the laws of Draco, an Athenian lawgiver, for things such as murder, treason, arson, and rape. Plato thought that the death penalty should only be given to those who can't be fixed or properly reformed, which I kind of understand. I think it's fair that if you can come back to society as a functioning, non-rapey, murdery pyromaniac, that you should be allowed back in. Either way, you're going to have to deal with the hate of the people you committed the crimes against, unless you killed them all. But that aside, you're being punished no matter the result. Carrying on, there are some Jewish and Christian people who found justification in the death penalty over the biblical passage Genesis 9:6. Whosoever sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, which is essentially the ancient legal principle lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for life, a common proverb we've probably all heard. That also exists in the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi alongside another horrible law, which states that if your crimes couldn't all be done unto you, then your family would suffer too. So, for example, let's say they want to hang you multiple times because you did something really evil. They can't because you can't really die more than once, so what they'll do to compensate is they'll kill your family as well, which is pretty bad. Japan had a peaceful period where they replaced all death penalty punishments with deportation, but not too long after that, civil war happened and they started killing people again. In Islamic law, the Quran states that capital punishment is condoned. In simpler words, they treat it as acceptable, forgivable, or harmless, which, that doesn't make any sense. The Quran also prescribes the death penalty for several fixed crimes, such as adultery and apostasy of Islam. The last one, apostasy of Islam, is essentially if you don't follow our laws of our religions, then you die. Nowadays, capital punishment isn't as frequent. In fact, it's still a heavily debated topic as to if it's just or not. As for the capital punishment, arguments generally fall under three categories: moral, utilitarian, and practicality. Supporters generally say that if someone has taken a life, they've forfeited their own right to life. They also think that capital punishment is just a way for retribution, which when said out loud makes you sound slightly like a lunatic, but it enforces the whole tooth for a tooth thing. Opposers think that capital punishment for taking a life is counterproductive in the moral message it conveys. They think that killing someone to repress killing is stupid, which does kind of make sense. It's kind of like being a hypocrite. You're not allowed to kill, and if you kill, I'm gonna kill you. What? Some people argue that killing anyone at all for this reason is inhuman and degrading, but you can ask what punishment is just for someone who killed. You can't simply let someone back out onto the streets if they've just killed someone. That's just dumb. Another argument is that death penalty has a distinguishably potent deterrent effect on violent offenders. Killers might not be afraid of being imprisoned, so let's give them a scary outcome: death. However, opposers have argued that this is untrue, but hey, it's still a decent argument. If you commit a crime and you are unfazed by the punishments, you'd probably be willing to commit the crime again. That's why bigger acts of crime aren't committed by the average person. Most people jaywalk because they're aware that them being jailed isn't going to happen. At most, you're going to be told to stop. But unless you're provoking the law, you know what I mean. If jaywalking had a $1,000 fine, I'm sure no one would jaywalk in front of police, but you get it. Now there's the arguments that are good arguments, the practical arguments. There are disputes about whether capital punishment can be administered in a consistent manner. Supporters argue that it's possible to fashion laws and ensure that those who are really, truly, absolutely deserving of death are killed, but I disagree. Opposers believe that any attempt to single out a crime as worthy of capital punishment will inevitably be arbitrary and discriminatory, which is to me. They also point to other factors that they think preclude the possibility that capital punishment can be fairly applied, arguing that poor and religious and ethnic minorities often do not have access to the same legal assistance as other, that racial prejudice motivates predominantly white juries in capital cases to convict black and other non-white defendants in unfair numbers, and that even in a well-run, amazing criminal justice system, errors are inevitable, which is, I agree. I agree with that. They also say that those condemned to death are often forced in a cruel way to think about their uncertain faith, which is understandable, but it's not like they just blow the accuser's brains out on the wall the second the judge declares him or her guilty. It's just not really how we do things these days. Now, the abolition movement. In the 18th century, a movement began to minimize capital punishment. Until this happened, capital punishment was applicable to common crimes like theft. You take your best friend's brand spanking new Louis jacket, well, you're dead now. Although I say that it was applicable, it wasn't always applied because juries most often acquitted defendants in minor cases, meaning the juries took the side of the defendant because, let's face it, stealing from a grocery store and being killed for it isn't really fair. Anyways, the abolition movement was the main reason for capital punishment not being as popular nowadays. The abolition movement caused Pennsylvania in 1794 to be the first to restrict capital punishment to first-degree murder. Following that, in 1864, Michigan abolished capital punishment altogether for murder in common crime. 17 years later, Venezuela was the first to completely abolish capital punishment for all crimes, including offenses against the state, which was huge for the abolition movement. In 1865, San Marino abolished the death penalty, it being the first European country to do so. Early 20th century arrived, and several others, including the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Italy, did the same as San Marino. They were removing capital punishment from their justice system, which is big. However, Italy being Italy and never knowing what Italy is doing for itself, they started reintroducing capital punishment thanks to someone named Benito Mussolini. He was a fascist guy, not really chill. In 1960s, approximately 25 countries had abolished capital punishment for murder, which was progress, but half of the 25 still used it for offenses against the state. A great example is Britain. They stopped using capital punishment in 1965, but kept on using it for treason, piracy, and military crimes until 1998. Now, nearing the end of the 20th century, those who had abolished capital punishment, added with the de facto group, de facto means it's legal but not practiced, made up more than half of the countries around the world. Capital punishment today. Despite the entire abolition movement, many countries have kept capital punishment around. Iran, Malaysia, Philippines, and Singapore have a mandatory death sentence for anyone in possession of drugs. Doesn't matter how much you have, how little or how much you have, you die. Fun fact, Singapore has the highest rate of execution per person of any country, 3/4 being drug offenses. Not really a fun fact. Sorry. About 20 countries give death penalty for economic crimes. 24 countries, mostly Islamic countries, give death penalty for sexual offenses. 60% of the states have the death penalty, and the states altogether contribute to 2/3 of the executions since 1976, and that 2/3 is just in 6 states, those being Texas, Virginia, Florida, Missouri, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. China is believed to execute around 1,000 people annually, at least until the first decade of the 21st century, which is aggressive to say the least. However, it's China, and no one can really confirm that statistic. Very few countries allow the execution of minors, which is good, and the execution of the mentally impaired was debated in the late 1990s, and they came to the conclusion that killing the mentally impaired wasn't okay. The states define mentally as impaired as anyone who scores under 70 on an IQ test that's properly given. So if your IQ is under 70, then you can't be killed. Now, you know the basics and then some of capital punishment. My thoughts on it: death is bad, In my opinion, all guilty people should be punished. Only guilty people should be punished. And they should be punished in proportion to the severity of their crime, which out loud makes sense, but killing people is a lot. Saying killing someone makes sense is a lot. My initial thinking about that is, do the immoral deserve to be morally treated? Which makes me sound even more evil, but thinking about the facts and everything I've just said, I think that death penalty is justified in a fair court without any sort of prejudice, towards someone who's killed or done worse. But then comes the whole, what is the death penalty punishable for argument, but that's like a whole nother story. That being said, I'm not saying killing people is okay, but kill or be killed. That's it for this whole video thing, whatever you want to call it. I hope you hated it, unless your name is Greg Van Dyke, in which case an 86 or higher will do. Anyways, goodbye.